Major support for these broadcasts is provided by New York Community Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chelsea Lighting, Capital One Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance, Genova Burns, Giantomasi and Webster, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, the Wickoff Group, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank. Additional support is provided by Ackman Ziff Real Estate Group, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, C.B. Richard Ellis, Colliers International New York, LLC, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, DDG Partners, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Flushing Bank, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Stirling and Stirling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, and these friends.
So here we are today, and I have my friend, philanthropist, insurance broker, David Stirling. David is the chairman and CEO of Stirling & Stirling, the 38th largest private insurance broker in the country. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike.
So David, you know, as you and I know, I always like getting a little history about the family. So why don't we go a couple of generations before? Let's talk about your grandparents and even prior to the grandparents. Tell me about the family, because I know there were bagel bakers over there were rabbis, there were a variety of people.
Well, you know, on my mother's side, my mother's family was from Lithuania, a little shtetl called Januszek, and my great-grandmother was a bagel maker there, which was a very unusual profession for a woman in those days. But they left the shtetl to come to the U.S.
So when did they leave the shtetl to come to the
Well, my
US?
grandmother was around 10 years old, so I'm guessing it was, you know, right around the Russian Revolution in that time.
And where'd they settle?
Mount Vernon in New York.
And what about your grandfather?
My grandfather came from Russia, and he came over with his parents, again around the, no, I'm sorry, he came over a little bit later, he was a little bit older, but again in the same general time frame, and he came from Austria, Poland. So it was Polish on the Austrian side. So they were candy makers.
Right, and which is interesting because you were telling me that he was involved with the sugar company and corn syrup. Tell me about that.
Yeah, he worked for Consolidated Corn Products, and he was the sales engineer to go into all the bakeries and manufacturers of food products and show them how to change their manufacturing process to accommodate corn syrup. Corn syrup was going to create a better food more effectively, more efficiently, and he was very successful about that. With that, there's a history book on sugar that I've seen with his name mentioned in it as being a key player in making the conversion from sugar to corn syrup.
So how did your grandparents meet? Your grandmother was in New Rochelle. Your grandfather was in the city.
Yeah, well, my grandmother was in Mount Vernon. I don't remember the story about how they met, but they met when my grandmother was 13, 14 years old, and he waited for her to be the right age.
18, you said, right?
Yes, so that he could marry her. He fell in love with her. He was smitten from the moment he met her.
So he's selling as a salesman, okay? Your grandmother's a housewife at this
That's
time?
correct.
Now, your grandmother's side was the very religious side with the family of rabbis?
Yes, my grandmother was a Klavan, and there was a lot of rabbis that were Klavan. Israel Klavan, her nephew was the head of the Rabbinical Council of America for many years before he passed on. And Hillel Clavin is a prominent rabbi in the Baltimore area. And in Lithuania, they were a very prominent rabbinical family.
Okay, so now let's go to your grandmother. Tell me about her.
My grandmother was really the matriarch of that side of the family. She kept everybody together. She was in everybody's business. She made sure she understood what was happening and where it was happening. She was an amazing cook and baker. Her mandel bread, you know, her just about everything that she made was just incredible, and we still have those recipes today.
So now let's go to the next generation. Your mother and your late father. Where'd they grow up?
So my mother, my grandfather and my grandmother moved to the Bronx, where they raised their children. They had 3 children. My mother was the middle. And my mother met my father at Camp Delwood, which is no longer in business. My father was the waterfront counselor when they met. I was reviewing some pictures the other day of Camp Delwood. My father took everything in slides, and I recently had all the slides converted to digital.
And tell me about your grandfather, because he really was at a different name. He didn't call himself Stirling at that time. Tell me about your grandfather.
Well, my father's father came from Russia, and when they came over here, he was a young man, and their name, actually a young boy, their name was Strelzik. Now, Strelzik is the Ukrainian word for Capricorn, Sagittarius, the hunter. And I was recently in Poland, and I saw Strelitz is the way they pronounce it, but it's the same word. And in the 1950s, my uncle and grandfather were in the insurance business, and Strelzik was just too difficult a name to do business
And that's how it
under.
became Stirling and Stirling.
Changed to Stirling, and my father agreed.
Now, your father, you said to me, went to Brooklyn Tech, and he went to City College.
Yes.
And your mother went to NYU, I believe?
My mother went to NYU.
NYU, and she became an audiologist.
And speech therapist, yes.
Speech therapist. And your father became, an engineer?
He was an engineer, an electrical engineer, and he worked for a company called Polarad Electronics. And they did a spin-off that he had ownership in to make transformers, and they called it Stirling Transformer.
And it was in the chic neighborhood of Williamsburg. I mean, it's just a pity.
Right.
It was 40 years before that,
That's right.
that anything happened over there. Now, your parents get married. They're living at this time where, in the Bronx?
Well, when they got married, they lived in Washington Heights. And right before I was born, I have an older brother who was born there, and then they moved to Roslyn, where I was born.
Okay, you're born in Roslyn, and you have a third brother also.
Yes, who was born there as well.
So you're born in Roslyn, and where do you go to public school?
Roslyn Public Schools.
But you know, I think growing up as a kid, and it relates so much to your involvement in philanthropy, you know, some things you remember, and we were talking prior to the show about this book fair. Tell me about the book fair.
Well, we were brought up in a kosher home, and we belonged to a conservative shul, and we went to the Hebrew school. And the Hebrew school would hold a book fair, and we'd usually buy the normal books. I remember one was a book about LBJ, the first Jewish president, and it had all Yiddish sayings about LBJ. It was very cute. And
I didn't realize he was the first Yiddish president, but okay.
And then there was a book. It had all pictures, photographs of LBJ, and they put Yiddish captions on it. It was very cute. And then there was this book that caught my eye. I don't know why I bought it. I was very young to be buying a book like that, but it was called Tzedakah. And it was really a book about the Jewish value and practice of tzedakah and why it's important. And I read that book cover to cover. It was an easy read. And I know that, I remember it to this day. I must have been 8, 9, 10 years old. I remember it to this day, so I know it had an impact on me.
We'll get to that later on in your life. So you go to public school, and you were talking to me that when you were growing up, in 1932, your grandfather created an insurance agency, correct?
That's correct.
Central.
Well, what happened, my grandfather owned a chain of needlepoint stores throughout the 5 boroughs, and he lost it in the Depression. And he went into insurance almost by default, and he was in a bullpen up at the what's now the Monday Properties building, used to be the Helmsley building over by Park Avenue there, and working for the Travelers Insurance Company. In 1932 is when he started doing that, and ultimately he called himself Central Underwriters Agency.
Then your uncle joins him in 1948?
48. My uncle, out of the Navy, went to NYU, and then joined my grandfather in the Central Underwriters Agency. And they moved it to Forest Hills, which is where my grandfather was living.
When did they change the name to Stirling and Stirling?
I believe that change happened around 1960.
When you were going to, and your father joined the company in 58.
He joined the company.
Right, he left the transformer
left
business.
the transformer business and took his engineering mind and applied it to insurance.
And it was good because, as you were saying to me, your uncle was more of the salesperson.
Yes.
And your dad was more of the internal person. So it was a perfect marriage on handling the business.
Really, you know, from 1948 to 1958, I'm told that it was my grandfather and my uncle and 2 assistants. And from 1958 to 1968, you know, by 68, with my father there being 10 years, being able to manage the inside and the carrier relationships and things of that nature, my uncle was freed up to do what he was fantastic at, and they had about 30 people, you know, in that interim.
Now, what's interesting, what you said to me is that your dad would like create projects when you were going to high school. You were able to, he would make this mundane work like file cabinet, doing file papers, something interesting in the insurance business. Because when people hear, they say insurance, it's a necessary evil, but it's really a very important thing. So,
Mike, we have an expression which I repeat all the time. Anybody you meet in the insurance in business got into it by accident. Nobody tries to get into the insurance business. And it's not one of the sexy industries. And so my father was really terrific. One time he needed me to work on some bookkeeping statements, which was a really tedious job. And he said, how would you like some detective work? Because we had to figure out where some things were coming from. And he knew how to get you excited and keep your head in the work. He was very good at that.
Here's a question which I didn't ask you in our pre-meetings. When you were growing up, did you ever go to Israel?
In 1969, when I was 13 years old, for my bar mitzvah, my parents took myself,
And your
my brothers, and one of my grandmothers. We all went to Israel, Greece, and Italy for.
Well, which is interesting because it relates later to the story over there. I just wanted to get that. You graduated high school. How do you decide to go to Wisconsin? I know Madison, Wisconsin is a great place, but how do you decide to get to Wisconsin?
Well, first I got to tell you that I went to Roslyn High School, so we had probably a couple of hundred people in my graduating class, and 25 of us went to Wisconsin. So.
What was it, the football team? It sounds like.
Actually, that year, there was a book called The Insider's Book to Colleges, and Wisconsin was rated #1 for education and partying. So I think that's probably what got everybody excited.
So what made you go to Wisconsin?
You know, I was interested at that time in psychology. They had a very good psychology program. With my grades, it was the kind of school I thought I could get into.
But why psychology? You know, I understand people they fall into the insurance business. What was psychology insurance, which is very important because it's very important to deal with your customers and your people. But how do you decide on psychology? I mean, your older brother, you said to me, wanted to be a physician because part of the ethnic of growing up as a middle-class Jew is you should be a doctor. I mean, you know, insurance guy now.
I had an aunt and uncle. My aunt recently passed away, and my mother's sister, and my uncle, her husband, were people that had a major impact on me growing up. They were both psychologists. They were pioneers in many of the psychological movements, including weekend marathons where they would, you know, work with groups of people to try to use the group dynamic to therapeutically. And I just idolized them and adored them. And it seemed to me to be what I wanted to do with my life.
Now, what's interesting is when you went to Wisconsin, sometimes people come home for the summers. Now, what is this with Rocco? Tell me about Rocco. Rocky Rococo.
I loved Wisconsin. I literally never came home. I spent my summers there.
You could have had a cheese hat, right, over there and everything else.
There was a pizza place called Rocky Rococo, and there was a comedy duo named Procter and Bergman. They went by the name of Firesign Theater. They had an album in those days called Nick Danger Third Eye, which was a spoof on the Beatles' White Album. So there's a song on the White Album, Rocky Raccoon, and
sure,
so this character, Rocky Rococo, was really a spoof on Rocky Raccoon. Anyway, they took that character, who was like a Peter Lorre character on the album, and they used it as a theme to create their restaurant. I actually met Procter and Bergman at Rocky Rococo's one.
So tell me about Rocky. You worked there all year?
I worked there just about from my freshman year till I left.
You learned how to
I made pizzas, I delivered pizzas, I worked the cash register, I did store manager, I swept the floor, I bussed tables. But I even was in the first filmed advertisement, the television advertisement. I played Rocky Rococo.
Did Rocky grow?
They did. They got a bunch of money from a fund, and my understanding, way after I left, they grew to maybe 300-400 stores.
So you could have been the Pizza King. You could be like Papa John's. It could have been David's.
Could have been, but I'm not sure what happened. But they ended up shrinking down, and they still exist today in Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay.
You can
Now, what's interesting, you said to me, things change. So you're working over there, you're staying over there, and then you came back, the last 30 credits or so, you came back to New York and you went to Hofstra.
That's right.
And you were working with your father at this time?
I was working full-time and finishing up in Hofstra.
And part of the reason that you did this is that, I think it may have been 1972, Stirling and Stirling, which was an entity, merged with a major real estate company called Arlen Realty and Development, and you tried to do a merger or relationship, and that really didn't work out well.
Well, it worked out well in the beginning, but then Arlen was before REITs, and they were the first real big public real estate corporation. And in 1976, they ran into trouble, and we had merged into one of their operations. So my uncle and father still owned a third of that operation, but when 2/3 of your premium is coming from one customer and they're having difficulty paying the premiums, so there was an escape clause, and my uncle and father divorced their company from what Arlen had, and that divorce and that litigation probably ended 76, 77, and I joined the company in 78.
So here we are at 78. You're 20, how old?
78, I was 22 years old.
22 years of age. How large is the company at this time?
So at that time, we're doing about $2 million in commission revenues.
How many people?
Probably about 40 or 50 people.
But here's the interesting thing. As you said to me, at that time, your dad and your uncle moved on. Your uncle went on his own. Your father bought the business.
In 1980, that
1980.
happened. So I joined in 78 and 80. My father bought from my uncle.
Okay, the first 2 years you're learning the business. Now you're 24 years of age. Your father buys the business over there. And David Stirling, who's learning the business, who had a sales experience by selling pizzas, is now basically the sales manager, because your dad was the internal man who did this business. You're the sales manager of this company. What the hell did you know about sales?
Well, not a lot, other than selling pizzas over the counter.
But you took initiative, okay?
I did.
Certain people, there's Norman Vincent Peale, there are other books. I hope the book that I gave you that you better be reading, okay? And you took the initiative and you said, if I'm gonna be running this business, I better learn something. So you went to a Dale Carnegie class.
I did. I came to the conclusion at 24 years old, the business insurance that we sold was the companies who were larger middle market companies. None of my peers were in a position to influence the buying decision on that stuff. So I had to create a professional cold calling sales force. So I went out and took a course on how to do that. And I realized once I believed in what they said hire young people out of college with no insurance experience, teach them how to sell, and teach them insurance. And so I said, well, if I'm going to, I know insurance because I studied it in college, but selling, I better have to learn. So I enrolled in Dale Carnegie.
And where'd you find the first four recruits, as they would say, the rookies?
So I advertised for some. Some came in through some networking. Two came in through networking. Two came in, one of the rookies had worked, my father had a sailboat, and on the summers he would hire a young guy to help him maintain the boat. And he came in and said, I'm looking for a job now. I hired him. He turned out to be a huge success. And about 5, 6 years into it, after he built up a big book of business, he went to law school and became a lawyer.
Now, what's interesting about this is later on, basically, your dad sells you the business when you're like 32, I believe, right? Something.
1989. So yeah, I was 33.
33 years of age, but you know what's interesting? Part of it relates to timing and some of the things that happen in your life, and we were going over this. If you really look back to the book of Tzedakah, which is charity, but in reality, it doesn't mean that. It means helping. You know, it's responsibility is the word Tzedakah. Right. You told me that you once went to this event for the JCC, the Sid Jacobson JCC, and let's talk about that because I think that relates to a lot of your change of your life.
It was a turning point for me. Prior to that, I was giving the obligatory amount that we had an insurance industry UJA deal. So in those days, our company was giving, I think, $5,000 a year. And I would show up to the dinners and pledge it. And
you were the designated pledgee.
Right. And then, if this client or that client put the arm on us to give to a particular charity that they were being honored at, you have to do what you got to do. So, but the JCC was a local cause.
This was the Sid Jacobson?
Sid Jacobson. I was living in Roslyn. My children were young, and they were taking advantage of the JCC, which was in a little schoolhouse. And the plan was to build a new facility. And at a UJA dinner, they somehow sat me next to the director.
And you're at like 32, 33 at this time, right? Or
yes, absolutely, 32.
So what happens?
So he's asking me if I want to join the board. And I said, well, what does it involve? He says, well, you have to make a $10,000 pledge to the capital campaign. But you can pay it out over 5 years. It's the first time that concept had ever really been floated to me. And I said, oh, this is not a bad idea. And so I agreed to do that, and I felt terrific. I mean, I can't tell you what feeling it was, that I was really doing something for the community. And I sat on that board for many years. Throughout the planning process and the building process, I was initially on the operations committee, helping to hire the people to manage it, and what a rewarding experience.
One thing that you've done at the company over the years is people sometimes say, and I'm terrible. I mean, if I get a phone call at home at night, from a telemarketer, I say, disconnect me. I don't want to know you. I don't like you. You're not my friend. I don't want to talk to you. But something that you've grown, I mean, to grow in stature, to be the 30th largest privately held insurance company, is this telemarketing. Tell me about that.
Well, when I took that class back in How to Build a Sales Force, one of the things they said is that a professional sales force uses telemarketing to set up appointments so that the producers and the salespeople can be out more frequently. So from the early 80s, I've had telemarketers that I've managed. But about 6, 7 years ago, I was exposed to a firm that was using telemarketers far more effectively than us. I was able to, meet with them and ask them, how many dials is each telemarketer making? How many appointments are they getting per dial? And they were blowing my numbers away. So I fired all my telemarketers and I rehired them in a way, and you're going to find this number astounding, but with 5 or 6 telemarketers, we're setting up 200 appointments a month with prospects that pay over $100,000 a year in premiums for insurance. In the last year alone, those telemarketers have set up appointments for many $1 million+ premium accounts that we've ended up doing business with.
Now, But I think people have to realize this. It's great to get the appointments, but unless something that you and the company has really grown is that you've created specialty niches. And I think the specialty niches in unique industries, like you have a spa policy, you have you have a real estate policy, you have a family entertainment policy. You know, so you've gone and you've created these unique niches where it's specialty. So that's differentiating you from other people. And then also the engineering.
That's right. So what that's about is what I found early in my career. You'd walk into a prospect and you'd say, what do I got to do to get your account? He'd say, save me 25% and you can have the account. So if you're going back to the insurance companies with whom you deal and say, do business with me because I'm going to be 25% cheaper for all of my clients, the insurance companies are going to recognize that sooner or later that they're going to be making less money. So what occurred to us is it's a win-win. If we can teach the clients how to have less risk, reduce their risk, we can get them to spend less, and everybody's happy, everybody wins. And so we create an engineering department to go in and help our clients really manage some of the processes that create claims so that they can have fewer claims, and nobody wants a claim anyway, and reduce their risk, reduce what I call their risk profile, and get lower premiums. And that's been the theme. In fact, if you look on our website and our business cards, our letterhead, we put everything on there, reduce risk, spend less, because we want everybody to understand you can do that.
Let's get back to some charities and then to family. Besides, you know, it goes back, one of your involvements today is the American Friends of Rambam and the Rambam Medical Center, which I was involved with for many years. Let's talk about Rambam, APAC, and then the family.
Well, Rambam Hospital is just an extraordinary place. It's the only place on earth that has 2 Nobel Prize winners on the staff. The breakthroughs, the medical breakthroughs that they work on is something that is astounding. I became involved because a good friend of mine in Israel was the chairman of the Israeli Friends, and they were starting up an American, they were resurrecting the American chapter that you had been involved in, and he asked me to get involved. Okay. Actually, at the time, he said we were starting up, but I later learned that he was resurrecting.
Let's talk about family. You have how many kids? You and Mona have?
Between Mona and I, is our second marriage, we have 5 children.
Mona is a very successful real estate lady.
Mona has been in the paper, and I think she'll be in the paper again shortly for one of her other accomplishments. She's developed a wonderful project in New Rochelle that was a sellout about 10 years ago. She developed a fantastic project on West 19th Street in Chelsea, the Chelsea Club. Tremendous success.
Now in Williamsburg she's
now Williamsburg, she's got a building, she's got a tiger by the tail with that one, and she's gotten a lot of press from that.
Let's go over the kids, ages and what they're doing today.
So Ian is almost 30. He's my oldest. He's in the insurance business. We have Jonathan, who's the next oldest, 28. He's in the insurance business. We have Jeremy, who's the next oldest. He's in a credit card processing business we're involved with. And then we have Sam, who's the next oldest. He's with Mona and going to Baruch. And Melissa's in law school at Cardozo.
So I'd say, you know, for someone who didn't really think he was going to get in the insurance business, who gained a lot of insight by making a trip to Israel on his 13th birthday, especially with APAC and all the other situations, you've truly built a nice business. I'm happy to consider you a friend.
Oh,
thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.